The Committee on Science, Space, and Technology will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. Welcome to today's hearing entitled Resiliency, the Electric Grid's Only Hope. I'll recognize myself for an opening statement and then the ranking member. Today, the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology will examine the ongoing effort by federal agencies, industry, and the Department of Energy's national labs to ensure that a resilient U.S. electric grid can deliver power to American homes, businesses, and essential services. This hearing specifically will consider the recommendations made by the National Academies of Sciences in their July 2017 report identifying ways to enhance the resiliency of our electricity system. This committee has held hearings addressing physical and cyber threats to our power system, as well as technological solutions to stop or prevent damage from these attacks. But we often ignore the fact that damage to the power grid can and will continue to occur. We cannot predict when a cyber attack would threaten our power supply, and as we were reminded a few weeks ago with the impact of Hurricane Harvey, we don't know when the next devastating natural disaster will occur. Instead of simply focusing on threats, we should prioritize improving the resiliency of our electric grid. The resiliency of the grid is the ability of system operators to prevent disruptions in power, limit the duration of a power disruption, and quickly repair potential damage. Resiliency is also increased by incorporating data analytics and anecdotal evidence to improve preparation for future disruptive events. Since it is not a question of if, but a question of when the power grid will face significant physical and cyber threats, resiliency should be a priority for our electricity system. Congress requested that NAS conduct a study on the resiliency of the nation's electric system. The final report was authored by a group of academics and industry partners with a knowledge base in electrical systems, engineering, and cybersecurity. The author of this report, Dr. William Sanders, will testify today on the NAS report and its recommendations. The report recommends government and industry collaboration and improved data sharing as the primary strategy for improving the resiliency of the nation's electric system. The NAS report also stresses the importance of the federal government's investment in the kind of long-term, early-stage applied research and technology development that is the mission of the DOE National Labs. DOE maintains research infrastructure at national labs that is vital to better understanding and operating our electricity system. High-performance computing systems can conduct complex modeling and simulations that predict potential electricity outages and plan responses to attacks. And information sharing programs like the Department's Cyber Risk Information Sharing Program facilitate industry communication on shared threats. By partnering with industry through the national labs, DOE can provide critical knowledge and enable the deployment of new technology that improves grid resilience. There are still challenges to improving resilience. The current federal programs to protect and preserve our electric grid are fragmented and complex. Within the Science Committee's jurisdiction alone, programs to improve grid security and resiliency are funded at the Department of Homeland Security, FERC, FERC, the Department of Energy, and the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And incorporating utilities across the country, both large and small, adds even more complexity. Agencies will need to work together to simplify the information sharing process for industry. Federal agencies, including DOE, must also prioritize the early stage research that industry does not have the capacity to undertake. This will lead to the next generation technological solutions. I thank our witnesses today for testifying about their valuable efforts in research and giving their insights about operations of the electric grid. I look forward to a productive discussion about how federal agencies can work with industry to secure a resilient electric grid and what role Congress should play in providing direction and oversight to this complex process. That concludes my opening statement, and the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Vesey, is recognized for his.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Smith, for holding this very important and timely hearing today. I really appreciate that. I'd also like to thank the distinguished panelists for being here this morning. I'd also like to thank Dr. Dillingham in particular. It's my understanding that your house was affected by the storm, and hope that you and your family are doing okay now. and recovering well. And also, I look forward to this hearing, and because I want to hear your professional findings and your firsthand account of what storms like this can cause to communities across the country. I'm also interested in learning what we can do to improve their ability to restore power and other essential services as quickly as possible. Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria are very unfortunate examples of events that our world's leading scientific institutions, many times here in this committee, have warned us would happen more often. It is difficult to attribute any single storm to one specific cause, but there is a strong scientific consensus that human activity is responsible for conditions that may lead to more frequent and intense hurricanes, and the severity of these events may continue to get worse unless we do something to change our trajectory. This is a major reason that resilience is so important, and I'm glad that we are elevating our examination of this topic today. With that said, I'm very concerned again with how the Department of Energy may actually be using and redefining grid resiliency to accomplish a political agenda. Just last Friday, the Department of Energy submitted a proposed rule to FERC with the direct purpose of adjusting market rules to favor coal and nuclear plants because they may have several weeks of fuel on site. The department asserted that this makes these plants more resilient than natural gas and renewables, and therefore deserve extra compensation for this attribute. And I would imagine, Mr. Chairman, that there are probably some people that drill in Texas for natural gas that will probably disagree with that. Now, to be clear, I'm a very strong supporter of developing and incentivizing carbon capture methods and technologies. It will help us reasonably use the abundant fossil fuel resources our nation has at its disposal, including coal. I also support the development and deployment of next-gen nuclear technologies while doing what we can to safely extend the lifetime of our current fleet. But that doesn't mean that we should unfairly favor coal and nuclear without a strong, independently reviewed justification. The department has leaned on its recently released report on the electric grid for its justification. But the lead author of that report, Allison Silverstein, pushed back against this mischaracterization of her work. According to the conversations she had with committee staff, the bulk of her work remained intact after she handed it to the department. However, the final report's specific recommendation supporting coal and nuclear plants due to their resiliency characteristics was not justified by any research that she or her colleagues were aware of. In a piece she published in Utility Dive yesterday, Ms. Silverstein took issue with how DOE interpreted her technical work in the staff report. Mr. Chairman, I would like to enter this article in the record.
With that objection, so ordered.
In it, she states the characteristics, metrics, benefits, and compensation for essential resilience and reliability services are not yet fully understood. Specifically, she concludes that at this point, we cannot say that coal and nuclear have unique characteristics that provide such resiliency benefits that they should receive special treatment in the market. This conclusion is also echoed by a thorough analysis released by the conservative R Street Institute on Sunday, which found that this proposal is neither technically nor procedurally sound. R Street summarized it as an arbitrary backdoor subsidy to coal and nuclear plants that risk undermining the electrical competition throughout the United States. And a story published in Energy and Environment News on Friday titled, "Flooded Texas Coal Piles Dampen Reliability Arguments" is an example of why this proposed rule may not have been as rigorously developed as it should have been. Never mind the fact that in addition to doing what we can to ensure the resiliency of the grid, the costs of unmitigated pollution from fossil fuels should also be incorporated into the costs. Propping up coal for one insufficiently justified reason without properly pricing a major cost of its development and use to our public health and the environment is not what I would call good policymaking. And before I conclude, Mr. Chairman, I would like to note that while the natural disasters are a considerable threat to our grid infrastructure, there are a number of other concerns to keep in mind too. Cybersecurity, physical attacks, our aging infrastructure, geomagnetic disturbances, all of those present unique challenges to grid resiliency. and I look forward to hearing all of these topics discussed today. And finally, I would be remiss to not remind the majority here on the panel that we are fast approaching the end of the year, and we have still not heard from Secretary Perry yet on this committee, and we need to hear from him. And I would think that with all of the Texans that are on this committee, that it would be like when he was with Randy Weber now in the state legislature, and he would feel fine coming on down here and talking to us. We've got East Texas, West Texas, the Houston area, Dallas, Fort Worth. We're all represented, and I'm sure that Rick, as we used to call him when I was in the Texas legislature, that he would feel fine coming on down here and talking to us and testifying. So, Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back my time.
Okay. That's a good pitch, Mr. Veazey, and a good statement as well. Thank you. Let me introduce our witnesses. Our first witness today is Dr. William Sanders, Department Head of the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the University of Illinois. Dr. Sanders received a bachelor's degree in computer engineering, a master's of science degree, and a PhD in computer science and engineering from the University of Michigan. Our next witness is Mr. Carl Imhoff, manager of the electricity market sector at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. With over 30 years of experience at PNNL, Mr. Imhoff has been involved with multiple electric power system organizations. He received a bachelor's degree in industrial engineering from the University of Arkansas and a master's degree in industrial engineering from Purdue University. Our third witness is Dr. Gavin Dillingham, Program Director for Clean Energy Policy at Houston Advanced Research Center. Additionally, Dr. Dillingham is the Director of the U.S. Department of Energy's Southwest Combined Heat and Power Technical Assistance Partnership. He received a PhD in political science from Rice University. Our final witness today is Mr. Walt Baum, Executive Director of Texas Public Power Association. Previously, Mr. Baum was the Executive Vice President of the Association of Electric Companies of Texas. He received a bachelor's degree in economics from Austin College with concentrations in political science, regulatory policy, and land use economics. We welcome you all, look forward to your testimony today, and Dr. Sanders, if you'll begin.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Veazey, and members of the committee, I'm honored to appear before you today. My name is Bill Sanders, and I'm the head of the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I was a member of the committee that wrote the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine consensus report entitled Enhancing the Resilience of the Nation's Electricity System. The subject of this hearing is resiliency. Resiliency is a fundamental and different concept from other abilities such as reliability or cybersecurity. In the context of electric power, a key insight about resiliency is that it attempts to avoid an event, in this case a long-term blackout, but understands and admits that avoidance may not be possible, and thus works to respond as quickly as possible, preserving critical individual and societal services, and over time strives for full recovery and enhanced robustness to further impairments. The reference studies focuses largely on the nation's vulnerability to large area, long duration outages, those that span several service areas and last 3 days or longer. It found that much can be done to make these outages less likely, but they cannot be totally eliminated no matter how much money or effort is invested. To increase the resiliency of the grid, our report argues that the nation must not only work to prevent and minimize the size of outages, but must also develop strategies to cope with the outages when they happen, recover rapidly afterward, and incorporate lessons learned into future planning and response effort. The report also recognizes that at least for the next 2 decades, most consumers will continue to depend on the functioning of a large-scale, interconnected, tightly organized and hierarchical structured electric grid for resilient electricity service. In addition to many specific recommendations directed to particular organizations, the report makes 7 overarching major recommendations. They're documented in detail in the report, and I'll just summarize them here. First, emergency preparedness exercises that include multi-sector coordination. Implementing available grid resiliency technologies and best practices, supporting DOE research in grid resiliency, creating a stockpile of physical components, namely transformers, that enhance resiliency, developing a means for grid cyber resilience, continuous envisioning of possible impairments which could lead to large-scale grid failures, and ongoing efforts as needed to mandate strategies designed to increase the resiliency of the electricity system. In all of these efforts, the joint and collaborative involvement of government, industry, and academia is key to their success. A new concern to the resiliency of the cyber portion of the grid and how that cyber portion could affect overall grid resiliency. The electric power system has become increasingly reliant on its cyber infrastructure, including computers, communication networks, control system electronics, smart meters, and other distribution-side assets. A compromise of the power grid control system or other portions of the grid cyber infrastructure can have serious consequences, ranging from a simple disruption of service with no damage of physical components to permanent damage of hardware that can have long-lasting effects. Over the last decade, much attention has been rightly placed on grid cybersecurity, but much less has been placed on grid cyber resiliency. The sources of guidance on protection as a mechanism to achieve grid cybersecurity are numerous and documented in the report. It is now, however, becoming apparent that protection alone is not sufficient and can never be made perfect. An experiment, for example, conducted by the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association and N-Dimension in 2014 determined that a typical small utility is probed or attacked every 3 seconds around the clock. Given the relentless attacks and the challenges of prevention, successful cyber penetrations are inevitable, and there is evidence of increases in the rate of penetration in the past year. Serious risks are posed by further integration of operational technology systems with utility business systems, despite the potential for significant value and increased efficiency. Given that protection cannot be made perfect and the risk is growing, cyber resiliency, in addition to more classical cyber protection approaches, is critically important. While some work done under the cybersecurity nomenclature can be used to support resiliency, the majority of the work today has been focused on preventing the occurrence of successful attacks rather than detecting and responding to partially successful attacks that occur. As argued in the report and in our overarching recommendation number 5, further work is critically needed to define cyber resiliency architectures that protect against, detect, respond, and recover from cyber events that occur. So the title of this hearing, Resiliency, the Electric Grid's Only Hope, is apt. The threat to grid resiliency is multifaceted and real, and the time to act is now. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you here today. I would be happy to answer any questions you have.
And thank you, Dr. Sanders and Mr. Imhoff.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Veazey, and members of the committee today for the opportunity to join this important conversation. My name is Carl Imhoff, and I lead the Grid Research Program at DOE's Pacific Northwest National Laboratory in Washington State. For more than 2 decades, P&L has supported power system resilience, reliability, and innovation for DOE and utilities across the nation. I also chair DOE's Grid Modernization Laboratory Consortium, a team of 12 national labs that support DOE's Grid Modernization Initiative, along with over 100 partners from industry and academia, such as ERCOT and Texas A&M and the University of Illinois. Today, I offer 3 main points regarding grid resilience. Point 1, substantial opportunity exists to leverage fundamental science and applied research to enhance the nation's options for modernizing the grid in ways that enhance overall resilience, and I'll share 5 examples. Point 2, the national laboratories have delivered important new approaches to enhance grid resilience, and I'll share some recent accomplishments and some emerging new efforts that were just recently announced. And point 3, state and federal regulatory stakeholders need resilience valuation tools, in addition to the science and technology innovation, so that they can better enable the required investment to actually deliver the science and technology innovations. Let's start with science and technology opportunities themselves. The definition of a resilient grid addresses both avoiding and resisting outages before an incident occurs, as well as rapidly responding to an incident and recovering as quickly as possible afterwards, 2 sides of the coin. Science and technology can contribute on both sides, avoidance before events and recovery afterwards. Specific S&T topics we think are vital to the future include the following: enhanced real-time predictive operational tools to detect problems early and steer around them, enhanced precision planning tools to better predict risk and design accordingly to make systems more resilient, advanced grid architecture, coordination, and control of the grid to pinpoint new structural risks and options on how to control the system and recover it more quickly. Number 4, advanced data and visual analytic tools for better situational awareness across all hazards, whether it's physical, weather, cyber. And then number 5, energy storage at an affordable price point to provide a new grid flexibility option for the future. For the hearing objective of improved cyber resilience, advanced data analytics and new grid architectures and controls would substantially improve the situational awareness of cyber threats and provide more resilient control options to prevent further system damage. And advanced predictive operational tools and energy storage would help operators limit the spread of cyber-induced outages. For the hearing objective of physical resilience, an important emerging tool is the development of design-basis threat assessments to frame the physical threat scenarios of highest priority to individual utilities. These systematic threat assessments linked with enhanced planning tools would better guide resilience investments for utilities and other stakeholders. Switching now to progress in the National Laboratory Grid Modernization efforts, a foundational project in that effort is developing metrics to support government and industry efforts in grid modernization. Grid resilience is one of those 6 metrics. It's one that's still under debate in terms of its definition, and it's closely related to the traditional metric of grid reliability, as well as emerging metric called grid flexibility. Other projects include dynamic contingency analysis tools to help planners better avoid wide area cascading outages like we experienced in the Northeast in 2003. This tool was developed in partnership with DOE and ERCOT, and soon will become part of ERCOT's regular planning efforts. Grid analysis and design for resilience was another recent GMLC project delivered for New Orleans to help coordinate microgrids and other critical functions like water pumping, et cetera, to help them ride through emergencies. Finally, DOE awarded $32 million last month to fund 7 resilient distribution public-private projects around the country to validate the performance of new resilience innovations emerging from the GMLC portfolio. My third point is that science and technology advances must be complemented by new tools to help utilities and regulators chart the investment strategies to improve grid resilience. Utilities at all levels, consumer-owned and investor-owned, must have the capacity to understand the value of alternatives to improve their system, and state regulators need the same tools to provide the regulatory incentives to deliver the resilience improvements at scale. The national labs are developing such evaluation framework with state and industry participation. So I conclude that science and technology innovation can enable a modernized grid that we can see, control, and protect like never before. Big data management, new data analytics, machine learning, and exascale computing will be central to delivering this modern grid and maintaining U.S. leadership. Grid resilience is intricately linked to other attributes such as reliability and flexibility, and new tools to value and simulate grid resilience concepts in concert with public-private field validation will accelerate national grid modernization efforts. I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Imhoff and Dr. Dillingham.
Good morning. Chairman Smith, Ranking Member VC, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I'm Gavin Dillingham, Program Director of Clean Energy Policy at HARC. We're a nonpartisan research institute in the Woodlands, Texas. Pleased to provide testimony on the resilience of the United States power infrastructure, particularly in respect to risks posed by extreme weather events. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the findings of the latest NAP report on resilience. It's very timely and important. It pushes forward the discussion that we must have to ensure a more resilient power system. A key area of interest for me is the discussion on the increasing intensity of extreme weather and the impact on the electric system. These systems must be designed and constructed for a multitude of extreme weather events. And I wanted to provide one example in specific to Texas. Texas has experienced multiple extreme weather patterns, resulting in significant power outages in the last few years. First of all, there was the statewide drought of 2011-2012. This multi-year drought placed considerable pressure on power generation, which is highly dependent on water for cooling. During the drought, there was not enough water to cool the plants, or the water was too warm for cooling. There was significant concern by ERCOT about losing millions of potentially several thousand megawatts of power if the drought did not end. A recent Argonne National Lab study looked at the drought situation found that the Texas grid could face severe stress due to lack of water availability, as well as derating of thermoelectric plants due to high water temperatures. The stress on the power system due to this drought is not only limited to Texas, it's an issue across the entire western United States, particularly in the arid states. In Texas, beyond drought, we've had 3 500-year-plus flood events in the last 3 years. The most recent being Hurricane Harvey, which dumped about 27 trillion gallons of water along the Gulf Coast. If you're familiar with Texas and the eighth wonder of the world, that's 68,000 astrodomes, or 86,000, astrodomes worth of water. If you actually added that out, it'd be about 400 square miles, about 128 feet high. I mean, a huge amount of water at one point. Left close to 1 million utility customers without power. The other two floods we've had was the Tax Day flood of 2016 and the 2015 Memorial Day flood. Flooding can cause significant damage to transmission and distribution systems, particularly substations, and the potential long-term duration of floods can significantly delay the restoration of power to communities. I'd be remiss not to mention Hurricane Ike, which happened in 2008. During Hurricane Ike, 2.1 million customers lost power. Many of them were out of power for over 2 weeks, which is actually fairly small when you look at what just happened with Hurricane Irma, where there were over 9 million customers that lost power, and then you look at the Hurricane Maria, which essentially took out the entire island of Puerto Rico. Texas also deals on average with 146 tornadoes per year, wildfires, and ice storms, and most recently the Texas Panhandle January 2017 ice storm that cut power to 31,000 customers. This is one example of one state. Similar stories of extreme weather events can be found across all states. For more info, you could check out the Department of Energy's U.S. Energy Sector Vulnerabilities to Climate Change and Extreme Weather. Natural disasters will increase in number and have already increased in intensity, and this puts our existing grid at risk. It's very difficult to determine the timing, location, and intensity of these events. With this level of uncertainty and when financial resources is limited, it is challenging to make the appropriate investment decisions. When decisions are not made, infrastructure is not built, and our systems are not prepared. This results in significant damage and loss. Uncertainty is the enemy of action. Fortunately, we're seeing the deployment of downscaled regional climate models to provide improved certainty of the likelihood of extreme weather events. Texas Tech University Climate Science Center is a great example of doing some of this work. Better visibility into future climate patterns will improve planning for power systems and decision making, and then more investment must go into these models to reduce further uncertainty. Some of the solutions we like to discuss. First of all, in the United States, the power portfolio is very highly water dependent. Approximately 85% of our power generation requires water. Fortunately, systems not requiring water are being deployed across the country, largely in the form of wind and solar generation systems, battery storage, and microgrid. However, the speed at which these systems are being deployed does not look to significantly shift the grid away from water dependency. Projections differ significantly, but regardless of what projection you look at, most of them look at over 60% of the power system dependent on water out to 2050. The technology and capability is available to quickly deploy these systems. Unfortunately, policy and regulations have not kept up. It should hearten the committee to know that the recently released DOE Grid Reliability Study finds increased deployment of renewable resources has not and will not negatively impact the operation of the grid. This should remove some of the policy and regulatory headwinds here. A key issue is availability of funding. Two funding mechanisms that could increase the deployment of renewable energy is to allow renewables to participate in master limited partnerships, similar to what fossil fuel assets are allowed to participate in, and allowing the deployment of green bonds to fund renewable infrastructure. These are two market-based funding solutions. Other hindrances are the patchwork of grid interconnection standards, old utility models that do not account for the benefits of DER. We should also start looking into PEER, Performance Excellence Electricity Renewal. These are voluntary power resilience standards that should be considered to improve the reliability and resilience and operational effectiveness of our grid. And then also looking at microgrids and microgrids with combined heat and power. These are proven systems to increase resilience of critical infrastructure. Estimated that 3.7 gigawatts of microgrid systems will be deployed by 2020, which is small in comparison to other resources, but a very important resource is we look for systems that are resilient and have demonstrated their efficacy through a wide number of natural disaster events, most recently being the UTMB in Galveston during Hurricane Harvey. The DOE has actively worked to increase deployment of CHP through its Better Buildings Initiative Resilience Accelerator and Combined Heat and Power Technical Assistant Partnership. It is recommended this technical assistance continue. To conclude, the tendency is to count the number of hurricanes and extreme weather events and make that the key climate metric. The numbers are increasing. There is uncertainty when exactly there will be a material increase, but that is largely irrelevant as the intensity of these storms increase. There's considerable agreement by climate models that they will continue to do so. We are not prepared for this growing intensity. Natural disaster threats are real and now directly impact the operation of our grid. If we continue business as usual, systems will become more vulnerable. The economic and societal disruption cost will increase and recovery will be less sustainable due to growing demand on constrained resources. The technology and systems exist that are being deployed now to limit this risk. However, barriers exist with funding, regulations, and utility models that hinder the deployment of these resilient systems. Thank you for the opportunity today. Sorry
Thank
for
you,
going long
Dr.
there.
Dillingham. That's fine. Mr. Baum.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Vesey. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today. My name's Walt Baum, and I'm the Executive Director of the Texas Public Power Association. TPPA represents the 72 municipally owned utilities in the state of Texas. We represent about 15% of the customers. In Texas, you also have electric co-ops that serve another 15% of the customers, and then the investor-owned utilities serve the rest. TPPA is also a proud member of American Public Power Association, APPA. I'm here today to talk about a real world example of a resilient grid, and that is how ERCOT, the grid that serves most of Texas, recovered from Hurricane Harvey. I don't have to tell any of you about the devastation that Hurricane Harvey caused. All of you have seen it. Many of you experienced it firsthand. It was an incredible storm that Dr. Dillingham talked about, all the water and wind that was dropped. It really was two different storms when it hit Texas. It was a wind event in the Corpus area where it first made landfall as a Category 4 hurricane, and a lot of transmission was damaged. But then as it moved on to the coast and into the Houston and the Beaumont-Port Arthur areas, it became much more of just a rain event. And utilities there were dealing with flooded substations and other issues. In the Corpus area, AEP, the utility which serves the Corpus area, they alone had over 550 transmission structures that were damaged and 5,700 distribution poles that were hurt by the storm. And as we said, down in the Houston and the Beaumont-Port Arthur areas, you had flooded substations. We actually had to bring in some temporary mobile substations to replace those flooded substations, which is newer technology that probably wasn't available 10, 15 years ago. We're proud of that. It was a tough storm, but the story is largely good in Texas. There were right at about 1.5 million customers were affected, but not at any time because of the way that the storm was very slow moving. We never had more than about 300,000 customers out at any one time. And all customers were restored. 96% of the customers were restored within 14 days when storm first made landfall. There were a few others that took a little bit longer to restore just because of flooding and high water. But as of 20 days after the storm originally made landfall, all customers who could take power were back and receiving power. And we're really proud of that work and the tireless work of linemen and line workers to repair the grid. Reliability and resiliency are really closely intertwined concepts in the electric grid. Reliability is when you turn on that switch, are the lights going to come on? And resiliency is when those lights don't turn on when you flip that switch, how long does it take to get them back on? Our goal is always 100% reliability, but because we can't prevent weather or other man-made emergencies, a reliable grid must have built-in resiliency. Every storm's different, and Harvey's historic. And because I'm from Texas, this is where I'm contractually obligated to say this wasn't our first rodeo. Utilities nationwide plan and coordinate to prepare for these types of events, and plans address how crews will be deployed and how information will be shared with customers, and when to call for additional help. Grid resiliency is really part of day-to-day operations in the electric utility industry, from going out and doing tree trimming and vegetation management to when you're planning the grid, planning it with redundancy in mind, and grid operators and utilities with generation plan for reserve margins to make sure there's ample power during our peak times, even if large generation units go offline. Transmission and distribution systems are always designed with redundancy, and ERCOT actually conducts annual black start training, which is done to simulate the total loss of our grid and bringing it back up from zero. Mutual aid is also a key important part of resiliency. Just as firefighters, police officers, and other emergency responders combine forces to help rebuild communities, line workers and other personnel do that as well. Crews from all across Texas and other areas of the country shared in our restoration efforts. Utilities that were most affected called in crews from other areas. In our systems, municipally-owned utilities went to go help out the investor-owned utilities after getting their systems back online. CPS Energy sent crews to help AEP Texas and CenterPoint, and not just electric workers, they also sent IT personnel to help them get their networks back up and running. APPA, the American Public Power Association, has its own mutual aid network, and they coordinate with EEI, the investor-owned trade associations, and NRECA, the electric co-ops associations. During Harvey, we did daily calls with APPA to talk about how the municipally owned utilities were affected, and then moved on to calls that DOE ran in which all of the different sectors of the electric industry got together to help. And similar coordination was in place for Irma. Once restoration was complete in Texas, we sent mini crews to Florida, and CPS Energy, Austin Energy, Denton, Garland, and other Texas utilities were all out there helping Florida. And we have our own mutual assistance group in Texas as well to first respond to our different systems. While the story is positive, each event's also a way for individual utilities to learn and be better prepared for the next round of storms. Our new Public Utility Commission chair had a hearing last week in which she identified several issues for the industry and government partners to work together to prepare for the next storm. My members, public power utilities, and the entire electric industry are committed to sharing information, technology, crews, and equipment to continue to keep the lights on. I especially want to thank all the crews and personnel in our industry. Tireless work of the line workers and the support staff behind them is truly inspirational. It's also serious and dangerous business. Unfortunately, the industry lost a young lineman last month who was helping to restore power near Victoria. Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Baum. Thank you all for your testimony, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. And let me direct my first question, Dr. Sanders, to you. You will be challenged, by the way, to give a brief answer to my question, which is, what are the short-term and long-term steps that need to be taken to protect the electric grid from cyber attacks?
You're right. Professors are not known for being brief, but I'll do my best.
Okay. And if you have to pick, choose the short term as opposed to long term.
Okay.
No.
So first, let me say that there's a large effort underway today, much different than there was at the turn of the century, to protect the grid against cyber attacks. Since the early 2000s, the Department of Energy, the National Science Foundation, the national labs, and others have been working in this area, and substantial progress has been made. So in a sense, what needs to be done, and I think what we are doing, is taking a concerted approach where industry, government, and academia come together to work on this problem. Many ideas, technical ideas and technical solutions have been developed, and a short-term challenge, and maybe the most important short-term challenge, is to find ways within the very multifaceted landscape that includes regulation, that includes issues with costs, that includes states and federal governments, to find ways to implement those solutions. We've made substantial progress there, but there are many things that still have been developed that need to be implemented to make our grid secure.
Okay. And thank you, Dr. Sanders. And Mr. Imhoff, what can the government do to encourage innovation that will promote resiliency?
Another short answer. I think the key is to provide leadership, to encourage the combination of fundamental advances in mathematics, in control theory, in data analytics, and advanced computing, and link those closely with industry through bodies such as NERC, the Electric Subsector Coordinating Council, which is a strong government industry body, working with NRECA and APPA and others, to help move those fundamental advances to practice and implementation within industry. Step one would be field validation. Most of those are cost shared. I think most industry members would argue that they've been very productive. So I think from the federal standpoint, leadership to help drive forward the fundamental knowledge to help us innovate and stay in front of the wave is a fundamental contribution.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Imhoff. And Mr. Baum, in what way does the Texas electric grid, in what way does it differ from other grids and why?
The Texas electric grid we talk a lot about, Texas is very different and Texas has its own grid. ERCOT covers 85% of the area of the state and about 90% of the load. It doesn't cover the entire state. Areas in the panhandle and the corners of Texas aren't part of the grid, but we are. Our own grid power that is generated in Texas largely stays in Texas. Of about 70,000 possible megawatts of generation at any time, we can only import or export under 1,000 megawatts. So, we truly, I like to say that Texas is an island a lot on electricity. That sounds a little callous now with what's going on with Puerto Rico, but we are pretty much on our own. And so, that we are different from the rest of the country in terms of that goes.
Okay, but in positive ways that you just mentioned, because of the coverage and so forth. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you, Ms. Baum. Dr. Sanders, one last question for you. Would we benefit from simplifying our structure, having fewer government agencies and departments involved? I guess it depends on how you simplify, but do you think that's a direction we should go? And I think that's one of your recommendations anyway.
So the committee report was neutral on the actual government structure to be used. The committee felt very strongly that this is a complicated issue, that there are different issues, for example, the interaction between DHS and DOE that are working well, but these need to be coordinated.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sanders. And that concludes my time, and the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Vesey, is recognized for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to ask Dr. Dillingham a couple of questions, particularly as it relates to climate change and rising global temperatures. I know that there are a lot of people, including oftentimes on this committee, we hear that we don't know human involvement as it relates to climate change, or some people that outright deny that climate change is happening, even though there's a lot of consensus within the scientific community that there is some man-made contributions as it relates to climate change. And I wanted to ask you, as we consider potential infrastructure investments, do you think that states and utilities should consider climate change as it relates to the resiliency of the systems?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yes, and what we seem to find is that when we talk about climate change, there's usually like a specific type of event that's pointed to, like hurricanes or to floods or just one particular type of weather phenomenon. And when you look at climate change, there's a significant number of weather phenomenons that are happening here, from what I mentioned, from drought to floods to hurricanes to ice storms, and all of these events are becoming more intense and more extreme. And we've seen that actually personally, and we've also seen that within the future climate models that are being deployed. One of the things that needs to be considered, and we've been discussing this a lot more, at HARC and across the state is, now that these climate models, the downscaled regional climate models are becoming a lot more accurate in understanding the intensity and likelihood of these events happening, it needs to be at least part of the conversation here. We have projections for, in ERCOT, for example, we have projections for the amount of solar and wind that are going to be deployed. That takes into account historical weather patterns, but that does not take into account future weather patterns or future weather phenomenon. And so if we have models that we're getting greater, we're feeling more comfortable with and feel like they have better accuracy, it is important that we start including those within our projections and understanding of how the grids operate in the future so we can start developing in that regard.
No, thank you very much. That sounds reasonable. What about insurance companies? Do you think that they need to consider changing environmental factors when engaging with potential clients?
The insurance companies are way ahead of us on this. They already are doing this. They have their catastrophe models, and now they're bringing in the downscaled climate models. And many of their decisions now are based on potential future climate factors that they're looking into, and what's the risk of us funding this infrastructure into the future. And so what you're seeing now is actually development of resilience bonds that are actually being coupled with catastrophe bonds. And these resilience bonds are largely put in place by the insurance companies to mitigate risk. The Brookings Institute had a nice report on this a couple of years ago discussing the opportunity to bring in resilience bonds into the market, to bring in another kind of funding source, essentially, bring in the financial market to help better develop more resilient infrastructure. And so the insurance companies are way ahead in this regard.
This is, again, for you, Dr. Dillingham, and Walt. As you know, Hurricane Harvey was not the first hurricane to damage Texas and won't be the last. This is something that we've had experience with and will continue to have experience with. And communities are trying to look for ways they can harden their infrastructure to deal with future catastrophes. One notable example in Houston is the wall that was built after Hurricane Allison to protect the substation that provides power to the medical center. I wanted to ask you, how have communities adapted to the changing conditions that we're experiencing as a result of climate change?
So there has been, I'll just speak specific to the Houston region there. There has been some significant activity or growing activity in this regard. UTMB Galveston is an example that was flooded out during Hurricane Ike. They had to essentially close that down, and there was a question whether or not it even become operational again. But what they've done since then is they put in a combined heat and power system, which is an on-site natural gas generated system that operated great during Hurricane Harvey. They also built that above grade. It's up on the second floor, so it prevents floodwaters from getting in there, and then they also built a flood wall around it. So there's steps happening, especially within critical infrastructure, hospitals particularly, wastewater treatment plants that are going into place, and a lot of it is focused on distributed generation, and which is typically a combined heat and power type system being put in place. As far as just in the community in general, when you look at the parts of the community that have started taking action to be more resilient, so Meyerland is a neighborhood in Houston that's flooded multiple times. The homes that are starting to build above grade, the homes that are taking these, starting to put in these resilient standards to make sure that they're above grade, none of those flooded. So and those homes are in good shape. And so it's a matter of starting to put in place these voluntary resilience standards, educating communities, educating project developers, engineers, architects to understand what is the way to start building more in a more resilient fashion, but do it in a cost-effective manner. You can't do it in Texas if you're going to mandate regulations, and you're not going to do it if it's expensive. We built ourselves on low cost of business, low cost of living, and so what the important piece is how do you implement this stuff, and how do you build capacity within our building community to allow them to do this in a cost-effective way?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Vesey. And the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrbacher, is recognized for questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing today. And it is something I just think that we have not given serious attention to this. I know we've had several members over the years who have made it their crusade to talk to us about EMP and other threats, but it just, nothing seems to be get done, and there doesn't seem to be a national strategy that actually coincides with how vital this could be to the well-being of the American people. If we have something go crazy with the sun, I understand it could knock out all of our grid. I mean, you knock out 75% of the people's electricity in the United States of America. I mean, this is a tremendous threat that, and again, we're talking today about reliability and resilience. Let me talk to you about some real specifics rather than having the experts get together and talk about it, all right? What about a more diversified power, a system that we would then target that would be a much more diversified power source for the American people? Would that be a major step towards dealing with this potential threat? Anybody want to say anything about that?
Thank you for the question. I think that diversity, whether it's in diversity of fuel mix, diversity of generation and other things, provides resilience and robustness to the system.
Well,
And from the standpoint of EMP and space weather or geomagnetic activities, there are differences. The higher risk is at the further northern latitudes and the southern latitudes. I think the good news, sir, is that over the last year, both DOE has put in place an initial program plan dealing with the space weather issues. The Electric Power Research Institute has actually begun working on standards and operational approaches for component purchase and installation that would begin to deal with these issues. NERC has actually set 2 standards that are at the beginning of a journey that would help utilities better plan for and defend and operate through these storm events.
well, let me get real clear on this. We now depend on big, huge electric plants. And it seems to me that we could have, for example, and let me ask you whether this would have been one solution. If we would have determined 20 years ago or 30 years ago that we're going to build small modular nuclear reactors, which are now, we are told, we are very capable and have been capable of building, would that type of diversification help us solve this or deal with this issue?
So I think diversity, regardless of the type, regardless of whether it's natural gas or nuclear, can provide some resilience. But any device is going to be has some risk in terms of electromagnetic fields. They would need to have the protection, the shielding, et cetera, on critical components, regardless of the type of generation. So nuclear itself is not more or less robust.
But if we have smaller nuclear power plants in various communities, for example, which I understand we're capable of doing, and which are, by the way, safer, from what I understand, than light water reactors, that would not give us more protection than to have it in one major power plant?
So let me follow up a bit on this. As Mr. Imhoff said, diversity in the source of generation, both in the type and in the geographical distribution of the generation, can be helpful. With regard to the kind of solar events that you talk about, the same issues, whether we're diversified or to different degrees or not, will apply with regard to the resiliency of the transmission and distribution system of the overall grid. There are very interesting strategies that are talked about in the report. These include microgrids. These include island.
Let me ask this, would it be easier to fix if you've got a major source versus many smaller sources, a big nuclear power plant versus small modular nuclear power plants? No?
I'm not an expert enough to know that.
What are you going to say?
I can't speak to that either, sir.
Okay, well, let me just note that we also have solar panels that, would that be affected as well if a house, you go down right to the greatest diversification, which is individual homes, would this be more resilient and have more protection?
I can't speak to the inherent robustness of solar panels themselves per se. I don't think the outcome is to move to completely distributed energy. There are some values of some of the large centralized plants as well. So I think it's really an issue at each region, at each electrical region, whether it's Texas or the Western Coordinating Council or the Southeast. They need to look at their fuel diversity. They need to look at their prices. They need to look at their vulnerability to things like geomagnetic storms and figure out what's that right balance between centralized and decentralized activities. The one challenge, sir, what's changing at the edge in terms of today's grid is there's an explosion of new devices and new services and new innovations coming at the edge, many of which are outside the boundary of the utilities. Microsoft is providing its own power. Walmart is generating its own renewables on rooftops in their stores all around the country. So these are dramatic shifts in how we plan the system as opposed to how we did it 20 and 30 years ago. So I think it's regional and local. I think they each need to figure out what's the right balance of distributed versus centralized generation and supply. And that's part of what I think is so important about regional planning activities out across the country, doing what makes sense for them locally.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. The gentleman from California, Mr. Takano, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On Friday, the Secretary of Energy submitted a proposed rule to the Federal Energy Regulation Commission, otherwise known as FERC, with the explicit purpose of adjusting market rules to favor coal and nuclear power plants. The justification that they provided was for this was that these sources have several weeks of fuel on site and therefore are inherently more resilient than natural gas or renewable energy generators. However, this assertion, along with the overall proposal, has received widespread criticism not only from the renewable and natural gas industries, but from respected, independent, and even conservative experts on power markets. For example, Utility Dive just published a point-by-point refutation of this misguided effort by Allison Silverstein, who is the lead author that DOE hired to draft the grid report that the agency used to justify the new proposal. The conservative R Street Institute also released a thorough analysis on Sunday, which concluded that this proposal is, quote, an arbitrary backdoor subsidy to coal and nuclear power plants that risks undermining electrical competition throughout the United States, end quote. And Nora Meade Brownwell, a former Republican FERC commissioner, said in an Energy and Environment News article posted yesterday that she, quote, has never seen a credible argument, not one, that there is a problem with resiliency and reliability, end quote, due to coal and nuclear power plant retirements. On the contrary, a story published in E&E News on Friday titled, quote, flooded Texas coal piles dampen reliability arguments, end quote, and it's a clear example of how poorly justified this proposed rule really is. Now, each gentleman, I want to get through several questions. Do you think subsidizing the coal industry is an efficient and cost-effective way to make the grid more resilient? I would prefer a yes or no answer.
So I think first and foremost, we have to remember that resiliency is a system issue. No single source of generation can determine the resiliency of the grid. It depends on having enough generation in a distributed fashion, having the transmission and distribution infrastructure to deliver the power to the consumer.
Excuse me, Mr. Sanders, I've got to get through a few questions. Can you give me a yes or no? I mean, my question is pretty simple. Do you think subsidizing the coal industry is an efficient and cost-effective way to make the grid more resilient, knowing all we know about coal and competition with gas?
The report did not find that to be true.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Imhoff?
So just quickly, resilience is a system activity, and what I think is more important is what are those plants replaced with? If they're replaced with combined cycle natural gas or other things, those have equal or sometimes better resilience capabilities than the coal plant. I am not a markets person, so I can't really speak to the issue of subsidy.
All right, thank you. Dr. Dillingham.
I would have to answer no. Being from the state of Texas, we're not a big fan of subsidies, and especially in this case.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Mr. Baum.
The key is, as has been mentioned, is multiple fuel sources and redundancy on the grid, but I don't think any special subsidies is needed.
So subsidizing coal industry is not an efficient and cost-effective way to make the grid more resilient? Probably not. Would that be fair to say, Dr. Baum?
Probably not.
Okay, thank you, thank you. Mr. Imhoff, in your testimony, you discussed how energy storage could provide more flexibility and how operators might mitigate cyber outage and improve recovery. Can you expand more on the specifics of how energy storage is able to accomplish such a task?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Takano, and thank you for your leadership on the Advanced Battery Grid Caucus.
Welcome.
The issue around energy storage is it fundamentally decouples supply from demand. It's like a shock absorber for your truck that you drive down your ranch road. If the shock absorbers help smooth it out and enable you to keep from spilling coffee in your lap. Energy storage will help decouple supply from demand. And what that adds to the grid is flexibility. So if there's a cyber attack that takes out a certain substation or a certain supply sources, having that added flexibility in terms of energy storage linked with advanced control and power electronics that are smart power electronics, give the operator more degrees of freedom for how they steer around that problem. So that's the role it would play, adding more flexibility to the system to help respond to an outage.
Well, it's also energy source neutral. So if we found, in the case of Mr. Rohrabacher, small nuclear power plants were more efficient than the gas-powered plants, I mean, this still would be a tremendous addition to the resilience of the system.
It is source neutral, correct.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Tonko. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey, is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for appearing today. Have any of you read the book 1 Second After? It's a novel by William Forstchen. It was a New York Times bestseller. Well, it was obviously written from a report about the EMP, electromagnetic pulse threat, our nation faces, and if you're in the energy business, I would really commend the book to you to read. A little over a year ago, the Earth's orbit missed by about 1 week a solar eruption, which seems would have taken out all our satellite communications and probably destroyed our power grid. My question to you is what you think we should be doing to protect our citizens against that threat. About 60 seconds each would be appreciated with Dr. Saunders first.
So first, let me say that I am not personally an expert on this topic, but we did have expertise on our committee. And I've, on this matter, Tom Overby from the University of, or from Texas A&M University is an expert on this topic. I talked with him about this issue. And this is an issue of intense research. This is an issue of intense study. And there are solutions that are beginning to emerge, but they're in the early stages. They include raising awareness to the potentially severe impacts of GMDs. There's software now to plan for the impacts of GMD on systems, and people are using that to do studies. We're at the stage, really, where engineers are getting down to looking at what the real issues are. There are magnetometers that are being installed across the country to measure these kinds of disturbances. In fact, the University of Illinois has one on some land that my department owns right off site. And research is ongoing with groups like NERC and EPRI helping in this effort. So in summary, we don't have all the solutions we need now, but progress is being made.
Thank you, sir.
To follow up, nor am I an expert, but I will say the following. We have a number of disparate activities in the country related to electromagnetic pulse. We have a spread of tools, but what we don't have is an integrated tool set, nor do we have a common reflection across the 3 different waveforms, E1, E2, and E3. And we need to get to that so that we can provide guidance to industry for them to better shield and protect the new devices that are being produced for the grid, for which we are modernizing and investing heavily each year. So there is work underway. There are coordinating groups trying to drive that, but I think we need a more focused national effort to move towards a common set of integrated tools that reflect all three of those E1, E2, E3 waveforms. And the challenge is some of the solutions for geomagnetic sometimes might interfere or confound the solutions for the EMP waveform. So that's why we need this integrated view of the waveform so we can get a common voice to industry on how to design around this issue.
Thank you.
I would have to say Dr. Sanders and Mr. Imhoff are the experts here, and I did a good job as far as explaining stuff. I learned something there, but I cannot speak to this issue.
And I would say, this is an issue that is being studied right now. EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute, is conducting a multi-year study on this, where they are also releasing what they find every few months, and all different types of utilities, investor-owned, municipally owned, co-ops are participating in that EPRI report. I know there are, my feeling is the first thing we need to do is study and figure out what, if any, technical changes needs to be made to the grid, but I think you need to do the study and research first. There are people out there saying, we've got this quick fix that if you buy this type of Faraday cage or this type of new equipment, then you'll fix your problem. But I think we need more study first, and then decide what, if any, new equipment needs to be made.
Thank you. Which agency do you see having taken the lead in this, or do you think should be taking a lead in it? We've had hearings on this before, and I've found the industry had very little interest in this.
So my understanding is a group called the Mission Executive Council is actually working on this, and I believe that council has representatives from the Department of Energy and from the Department of Defense and other agencies that are linked to the satellite systems, et cetera. So I would start with that Mission Executive Council. I don't know a lot about them, but I believe there already is some coordination across the key involved agencies.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I see my time has expired.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Posey. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Tunko, is recognized.
Good answer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Obviously, this hearing was rescheduled due to the recent natural disasters. In light of those disasters, I believe it's an appropriate time for this committee to consider how to strengthen our grid. I would hope as we invest in the comeback for all the states that have been impacted by these natural disasters, and also areas like Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, and the various territories, I would hope we build a grid of the future. We've learned many lessons from Mother Nature. Following the devastation from major disasters, people begin to think and plan for all possibilities. In New York, the REV initiative borne by the New York State Public Service Commission came in the aftermath of Superstorm Sandy. It was inspired by Superstorm Sandy. That disaster showed the value of distributed generation and encouraged the state to invest in microgrid R&D and consider barriers to deployment. So, Dr. Dillingham, you mentioned microgrids paired with combined heat and power systems. Can you describe the value these systems add to our grid system in general?
Yeah, absolutely. So a microgrid system with combined heat and power is typically a natural gas-based system. And so what these combined heat and power systems do is they produce power on site and then also provide thermal services if it's for hospital sterilization, domestic hot water, steam for industry, manufacturing, and such. And so what we've typically found is that the natural gas infrastructure can be significantly more robust than a transmission distribution infrastructure. It seems to withstand a lot of the severe weather events. And so what we're seeing now is a greater deployment of these CHP microgrid systems, particularly in hospitals in Texas, and in kind of most of our region, in hospitals, wastewater treatment plants, first responder type facilities, data centers. And you're seeing a greater growing flexibility and application of these. At one point, combined heat and power was largely seen as kind of an industrial type of approach. Now you can get them down to very small, even residential size, to build even community microgrid systems. And in many cases, these are fairly diverse systems to where you have maybe the CHP or a natural gas generator as your base system, and then you have solar and batteries there as well. So you have an additional other types of generation components. But it's largely, a system that allows you to potentially island from the grid. So if the power does go down, you would want to island from the grid. And if you do have that you also need to have black start capability. So there's plenty of other types of components that go into a more resilient type microgrid system there that have been demonstrated and proven to work time and time again. And it adds to the diversity that we've been talking about of a power system.
Thank you. I would add that school systems where you might have a swimming pool as part of the phys ed infrastructure are also opportune.
Right, and shelters are used quite a bit for, or high school schools use quite a bit for shelters as a last resort, and that's a very good application for them.
Absolutely. How important is federal funding for the development of these systems?
At this point, it's a fairly mature system as far as the combined heat and power piece goes here. These have been around for quite a while. The diversity of applications now, most of the issues we find is there's just a lack of knowledge as far as how these systems can be used beyond, say, a gas refinery or beyond a natural gas processing plant. And how do we move this into a diversity of other groups? And so most of the work that we do has to do with kind of educating and kind of capacity building among those that have not had a lot of experience with this. It's like when you talk with someone about solar and they still think it's, $5 a watt, and right now it's down to 60 cents a watt. People still think the economics are not there, but they are now, and so you just need that education piece of that, as well as some early technical assistance. There, as far as microgrids in general, there's still some significant work that can be done, especially when you look at the communication devices, the sensors, how these are coupled together, how to do the appropriate optimization models. There's still some significant work that needs to be supported at the R&D level, but the basic component of like a CHP, combined heat and power system, is largely there and just needs to continue to be built out.
Thank you. The National Academies of Sciences July report on resiliency suggested that distributed energy resources, and I quote, may help avoid or defer the need for new generation, transmission, or distribution infrastructure to address congestion, localized reliability, or resilience issues. So, Dr. Sanders, if integrated properly, can distributed generation contribute to making a resource generation mix more resilient?
To give you a simple answer, yes. We believe that putting together distributed generation sources together with a appropriately engineered grid can add to resiliency.
And if we include other investments such as storage and microgrids, does that offer new opportunity?
Definitely, they are all possibilities. It's hard to predict the future, and in one of the chapters we talked about various futures and how the grid would have to adapt to those futures. But they're all things that could be part of the mix.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Tonko. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Weber, is recognized for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My district, 14 in Texas, the three coastal counties starting at Louisiana and coming southwest, arguably ground zero for Harvey flooding. It's just unbelievable. I have learned more about restoration and recovery and all of the efforts that have gone on that I ever wanted to know about disasters. And I hope I never get to have to use it again. So with that as a backdrop, Beaumont lost water because their electrical boxes lost their city water system because their electric boxes went underwater, and a lot of the infrastructure there, had it been raised above ground 6, 8, 10 feet or more, could have been protected. We're talking about infrastructure. Walt knows that I was on the Environmental Reg Committee in the Texas House and dealt with energy there that session. So this is very near, and I was an air conditioning contractor before I sold my company. So this is very near and dear to my heart. The great discussion. A couple of things I did want to follow up on. The chairman from California, Mr. Rohrbacher, talked about EMPs and SMRs. Of course, the SMRs are going to be more expensive to buy up front, so there's a cost factor there. But when you talk about EMP protection, I don't know probably which one of you guys can answer this. Does the EMP affect only a magnetic field that is in operation at the time, or is it all electrical devices?
Again, it's not my area of expertise, but I believe it'll affect all because it's going to create currents that will tend to overheat and cause issues in various electrical devices. But again, I'm not an expert in this area.
So that is to suppose that a jet engine in an energy plant built by GE or whoever, this turbine that's not spinning, in other words, if we had redundancy, if we had a plant sitting there that wasn't operating, wasn't active, EMP, solar flare, choose whatever method you want. You're thinking that that would destroy the windings in that engine. Dr. Sanders?
So once again, not being an expert, but talking with experts about this, my understanding is potentially yes, if they are connected to the grid in a way that that current can get to them. But I think the important point is there potentially, particularly when this is a solar-generated event, there is some warning. And so if we have appropriate detectors on the Earth, then we may be able to reconfigure parts of the grid.
You would have a main switch you could throw,
In a sense.
disconnected.
In a sense. It's probably not as simple as one main switch, but there are ways in which we could build protection according to the understanding I have.
Let me, you know, reading through this and going back through this brings up some really interesting questions. I think there's about 5 ways that we can help make our grid more resilient, and I'll just name them real quick. We need to have portable deployable assets. We talked about SMRs. We talked about other systems. Mr. Dillingham, you called it a microgrid of sorts, I guess. I don't know how you have a natural gas pipeline that's capable of running that kind of facility. High-pressure pipeline, that's one of the challenges. You have to have pre-approved, in other words, FERC, all of these agencies have to have pre-approved these in the event of an emergency. You have to have multiple assets. You have to have more than one you can bring in. They have to be close. You have to have trained personnel. And I know in ERCOT, Mr. Baum, you and I talked about this, we really have a good, like I said, I've learned more about all of the collaboration that goes on after a disaster. A network of first responders. If you've got pre-approved, if you've got portable assets, if you've got them close by, and you've got a network of trained responders that's cooperating, that will help harden our grid. Now you get to the transportation part, the lines and stuff. Fukushima taught us something over in Japan. Their nuclear plant, their backup power was too low. If we had our way, we would raise everything up 8-10 feet in the air at least to get everything above groundwater. Harvey was the single largest flooding event in United States history. So, you know, I don't know if we can come in and fix all of those problems and raise all of those things up. Mr. Baum, I'm going to come to you with a question. What kind of technology is available, in your experience, to stop a domino effect of power outages moving region to region?
In Texas, our grid operator, you know, is, as Dr. Dillingham talked about earlier, we deal with weather events all the time. Nothing as extreme as Harvey normally, but our grid operators are used to dealing with loss of certain lines or loss of certain generation. During Harvey, ERCOT they have certain power plants that they have under contract to provide emergency power when needed, and when we lost some transmission lines due to the storm, they were able to call those reliability unit commitments into play, and a couple of power plants spun up to provide voltage support for that area. So that type of coordination needs to continue. One of the things you mentioned earlier, the staging and the moving of equipment, having ways to, before Harvey and especially before Irma, being able to stage crews and equipment and already have poles on the way to help out, is very key. And like you said, with the having modular equipment, I mentioned earlier the mobile substations that we were able to bring in and keep power on the grid, and those type of activities need to continue. And it's like you said earlier, design changes do need to happen. In Houston, where you lost a big substation due to flooding, the Memorial substation, that had been there for 15 years.
Right.
I'm sorry, for 50 years, and had never had water inside it. But with this storm, it was flooded and was underwater for over 10 days. So that substation is being rebuilt with, the new normal to be prepared if we have another flood event.
Right.
And being raised and doing walls and other things like that, we need to look, we need to take what we've learned from this storm and be prepared to do those design changes.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate that. Like I said, I've learned a lot. Hope I never have to use it again, but it will be very, very important information to have. I'm going to now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney.
Well, I thank the sitting-in chairman for recognizing me. I thank the panelists. A moment of self-promotion. I care a lot about resiliency and reliability, and that's why with Mr. Lara, we formed the Bipartisan Congressional Caucus on Grid Innovation, and we produced some bills that are now working their way through the system to answer some of these questions. My first question goes to Mr. Dillingham. Is there a significant difference in terms of reliability and resiliency with regard to microgrids versus distributed systems, or do they pretty much look the same in terms of those two questions?
It's largely the same. I mean, it just depends on how you're defining a microgrid out there. There's still a considerable amount of definitions of what a microgrid would be, but it's largely a distributed energy resource. You know, typically, if you look at solar rooftop, it says just distributed energy. If you look at a microgrid, it typically has multiple resources associated with it, if it's solar battery, CHP, or the like.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned the adoption gap. Can you describe why that's a challenging problem?
That's been starting to be discussed quite a bit more, and just generally in infrastructure issues as far as how do we best prepare for climate change issues, and if that's water treatment or stormwater mitigation or our transportation infrastructure or power infrastructure. But the concern is, and the issue that we face is that due to the multitude of potential weather events that are being faced, taking one action in one area may not necessarily solve other actions. So if we deal with drought within our power system, does that necessarily solve high wind, ice storm, flooding, hurricane type issues? And when you are limited, financially limited, as we are, you know, within cities and with kind of just within our infrastructure budgets, you kind of have this difficulty of making the appropriate decision. Which way do I go as far as investing in the right piece of infrastructure? If I go and prepare for droughts, and then all of a sudden I have 10 years of floods, I look like I've really made a mistake here. And so that's one of the expectations with these downscaled climate models. They're becoming so precise now, you can actually start putting likelihood estimates associated with potential storm intensity as well as number of events, and those should start at least being considered being incorporated in our planning as we go forward, and that should potentially reduce that uncertainty.
Very good. Mr. Imhoff, your testimony touches on the effort in framing metrics to support grid modernization. What role can the federal government play in developing metrics for the grid?
Thank you, sir, for the question. The federal government is involved as part of the Grid Modernization Laboratory Consortium. We are framing a set of metrics for the next generation grid, 3 of which are the traditional usual suspects of reliability and affordability and environmental profile. But the new ones of resilience and flexibility are kind of challenging and under debate, but they're very essential as we go forward. So I think the federal government is providing some of the innovation to help frame and recast some of these activities, and they've established the opportunity then to work with states and the regulatory bodies and the vendor community and others to help test and validate these, and they're part of the current GMLC research portfolio.
I've been in standards committees, and they're a pain, but it's worth it. It's worth the effort. Mr. Sanders, is enough being done regarding the interconnectedness of the grid with oil, gas, and other natural resources?
That's definitely an area in which more work needs to be done. Much of the work to date has been focused on the resiliency of the grid, but as I think many of us agree, and as the report notes, that interconnectedness is important, so more work should be done.
Well, how would you rank cybersecurity issues with the grid resiliency?
Cybersecurity, if I understand your question correctly, is a very important impairment to grid resiliency, a very real impairment, and one of the important things we should consider. The report takes an all hazards approach. In fact, we talk about 12 different impairments to the grid. They're all important, can't leave them out. What we need to understand is to what extent can we build protections that can protect against multiple of these impairments, and to what extent do we need to build specific mitigations for them.
Well, then how does knowledge of previous cyber attacks prepare for future attacks?
Great question. Clearly, knowledge is very important. On one hand, knowledge can be used through appropriate information sharing in order to alert others that this particular vulnerability, which is being exploited, may be exploited in another location in a very close period of time. On the other hand, there are always new kinds of attacks, so-called zero-day attacks. And so we cannot rely purely on history to think about the future. In a sense, what we need to do, and this is where resiliency is very important, is we need to build systems that rather than protecting against very specific cyber attacks, protect against whole classes of effects those cyber attacks may bring on the grid. So by thinking about the effects and through resiliency, through that resiliency cycle, mitigating those effects, then we can begin to protect against zero-day attacks that we haven't seen before.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. The gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Banks, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What an incredibly important subject for us to tackle today, so I appreciate the committee diving deeply into these issues, and want to continue to talk about the cyber-related aspect of the subject as the growing number of the growing threat of cyber attacks is something that concerns me as a policymaker and does a number of my colleagues as well. And these are no longer hypothetical threats. We've seen 2 threats to the electrical grid in Ukraine, for example. And with these systems relying more and more on computers and information technology, we need to do everything, as you know, that we can to counter potential cyber threats. So with that, Dr. Sanders, could we take a step back and maybe give us a more specifically, how often is there a cyber attack or an attempt of a cyber attack on our national grid? And have we seen that number rise over the past 5 years?
Thank you very much for that important question. First, let me say that it's a very difficult question to answer. Different people have different bits of knowledge, some of that knowledge in the open, some of that knowledge classified, some of that knowledge in the hands of other countries, so it's a difficult question to answer. Having said that, what we're seeing is an increase in the rate of observed cyber attacks, right? We now have documented cyber attacks that are known in the public. We didn't have that just a few years ago. And we're seeing that the frequency of lower grade probing and attacks on both the operational technology and on the information technology, both on the, if you will, the online part of the grid and the offline control of the grid, those kinds of attacks increasing.
How do we monitor those attacks? I mean, can you give us sort of a dummied down version of how we monitor? How do we know that those attacks occur and exist?
Sure. So some of them are big, and we read about them in the news, right? The Ukraine attack and these kinds of things. Some of them we can monitor for. The lower grade, more frequent ones, we can monitor for using online technology. There are systems called intrusion detection systems, first popularized in our corporate information technology systems that can look for packets, that can look for behavior that tends to be abnormal and flag those as possible attacks. There have been specific versions of those intrusion detection systems that have been built for the power grid, both on the side of smart meters, for example. One was developed at the University of Illinois that's been prototyped and used at First Energy, for example, and other aspects of grid-specific kind of networks. Now, the trouble is those signals are not always clear. We get a lot of noise in those, and so we have to fuse that information together, and we have to create higher level intelligence that we then can make those determinations, and work to do that is ongoing.
So these might seem like obvious questions, but what do we know about these adversaries who carry out attacks like these? What are their motives? Where are they coming from? Can you talk a little bit? We haven't talked enough about that today. Can we talk a little bit about what we know about these adversaries?
Sure. I think I think we know a lot, but we know pieces of the whole story. We know that they come in all forms. We know they come from kiddie scripters up to potentially nation states, right? The evidence is pretty strong that nation states are involved. We know that they're coordinated. We know that they're deliberate. We know that they will wait. They will insert code into a system, and they may wait months until they activate that code. So the real challenge is to gain that understanding and to understand how to react to these things when the adversaries may be willing to wait months to gain their information.
An incredibly important subject, and hopefully, Mr. Chairman, we'll have many more opportunities to examine these issues. I appreciate all of you being here very much. With that, I yield back.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Banks. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And there's a technical question here. A lot of the really destructive scenarios that people worry about have to do with phase imbalances, resonant conditions, this sort of stuff, frequency mismatches that make it really hard to control the grid. These don't occur in a DC grid. And I was wondering what studies may have been done about the potential resiliency differences on DC grids versus AC grids, which have just a number of advantages that I can think of, just in terms of being able to passively protect them with things like diode clamps from, and the interface is a much simpler one. You have simply, are you delivering the voltage and current or are you not? And opening up the circuit. It just, from a number of ways, it seems to me it's a lot easier to protect. I was wondering what work has been done on trying to quantify that difference, and it may actually cause us to think over time of actually switching to a DC grid, which gets mooted from time to time. Yeah.
So I'll start but defer to the professor. As you know, the history of our system being an AC system is long. And it started 2 centuries ago, I guess. But there's substantial experience with DC interties, mainly today focused on movement of large amounts of power over long distance. They are more efficient, and you can actually ride above the AC system and not have to deal with a lot of the reliability, oscillatory control, and other things underneath in that AC system.
Right.
But it all gets down to cost. And so the planners, we have not seen a lot of DC activity here in the United States over the last decade until the offshore wind issues became emergent. And so there is more direct current activity in Asia and in Europe than in the United States. I think here is just an artifact of the economics of the current system, where we have a flat demand, we have a lot of inexpensive natural gas, and I don't think that the economics have really tripped it in the favor of more DC activities going forward. I will say that as part of the Grid Modernization Consortium portfolio, there is a study that's being coordinated with various ISOs, Midwest ISO, Southwest Power Pool, Bonneville, and the Western Interconnection, looking at seams issues in terms of how might DC overlays enable capacity sharing beyond the current interconnection boundaries, and what value would that provide and what sort of cost performance would that offer. So I think there's an emerging body of knowledge and analytic tools that might look to the next generation of the modernized grid and re-examine this issue of what might be the relationship between AC and DC systems at the bulk system level. And that study should be wrapping up in January, I believe. Yeah.
Well, the other thing that's changed is essentially all power that goes out, certainly at the consumer level, goes through an AC to DC converter. And so at some point, we've been just converting more than we might necessarily have to. And the pure DC system may have advantages just in terms, if we were to start over from scratch, I think we'd seriously consider a DC system. Also, if you add the requirement of EMP hardness, which is a very expensive thing, but may prove necessary. Cross your fingers that Rocket Man doesn't do what he's been talking about. But if that is a requirement added to this, then I think protecting a DC system against that will be, my guess, significantly easier than an AC system where you have phase and frequency to worry about. So is there any work, at the lower end in Europe or anywhere looking at at the distribution level DC system?
There is consideration of this notion of avoiding the transform and the inherent losses in the transformers to go to more DC. I think some of the large data farms and others are emerging that are very high consumers of electricity actually do some of that because they're inherently DC oriented inside, and so they're avoiding some of those issues. But it's more kind of localized and one-off evaluations, I believe. I'm not aware of anything substantial in the U.S.
Yeah, well, inside big data centers, for example, I believe they're switching to DC powers where they've got, many megawatts. And there's another big vulnerability that gets worried about, which is just how long it would take us to remanufacture many high-power transformers. Whereas it probably would be easier to rebuild the fraction of DC to DC converters that got wiped out in an EMP pulse. And so if you add that as a requirement, it may again tip the balance when you add the hardness requirement. Anyway, if there's anything specific that can be talked about either publicly or not publicly about efforts along that direction, I'd be interested.
I'd be happy to take that for the record.
Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Foster. And the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. LaHood, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the witnesses for your valuable testimony here today, and I want to particularly welcome Dr. Sanders, who's the department head at our flagship university, the University of Illinois, and for what you do at the electrical and computer engineering program there. Great to have all of you here today. Dr. Sanders, in your testimony, you mentioned your work at the U of I, the University of Illinois, with the Cyber Infrastructure for the Power Grid Center and also the Cyber Resilient Energy Delivery Consortium. Two questions on that. Could you talk a bit more about how these two centers are helping to make the U.S. power grid more resilient? And then secondly, is this the type of work that's happening at other universities?
Thank you, Mr. LaHood. I'll, at the risk of being self-promoting, I'll try to be a bit brief on this. The University of Illinois started work on cyber infrastructure, making trustworthy and making resilient and cyber secure the infrastructure for the grid back in 2005. I can say that this is a real need that we realized by the turn of the century, but it took time to get the attention of the funders and really have people understand this was an important thing to work on. The first of those efforts, TCIP we call, or the Trustworthy Cyber Infrastructure for Power, was funded by the National Science Foundation in a center scale grant, and in the wisdom of the National Science Foundation, even though the financial contribution was not large at the time, they brought in Department of Energy and Department of Homeland Security to work closely with us. It was very different than your typical academic research project. From the very beginning, we brought in people from industry and the national labs. People from Mr. Imhoff's group were with us at 2005 when we were defining the research agenda. People from about 35 companies came together at that first meeting, and they worked closely with us from that point out. A follow-on effort was funded by the Department of Energy, which is called TCIP-G. And TCIP-G expanded the scope to say, don't just do the good academic research, but find ways to transition that and get that in the hands of people that need it. Several startup companies have come out of that effort. Technology has been specifically transitioned to large power system equipment manufacturing, and you can see really that kind of input going on. Most recently, in 2015, there was once again an open competition from the Department of Energy, and the University of Illinois then received something called CREDC, that's Cyber Resilient Energy Delivery Consortium. And at that point in time, and I should say in the original centers that I talked about, there were 4 universities that partnered together. Now 10 universities and 2 national labs, including PNNL, banded together to look at resiliency issues in the grid. So that, once again, is a project that takes basic research, but takes basic research in an industry-government partnership in a way that we can have impact. In fact, my colleague, David Nickel, who is the principal investigator of the CREDC effort, is in Texas today talking with people from the oil and gas industry about how we can transition our technologies to them. We flew out together last night from Champaign, him to Texas, me to here, and this is the kind of effort we place going on. So thank you for that question.
Yep, thank you. Those are all my questions. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Hood. A good Texas-Illinois connection there. I didn't know about. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Christ, is recognized for his questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And let me add, thank you for holding this hearing on this important issue. As a Floridian, I certainly appreciate it. I want to thank the panelists for being here, too. Appreciate your presence and taking of your time to help educate us even more about our grid and its resiliency. I recently saw a comparison that the Energy Information Administration did on grid resiliency during Hurricane Irma and Hurricane Wilma, which hit Florida in 2005. The assessment states, quote, although the percentage of Florida customers without power during Irma was significantly higher than during Wilma, the rate of electric service restoration has been more rapid. 5 days after Irma's landfall, the share of customers without power had fallen from a peak of 64% down to 18%, a recovery rate of about 9% of the customers per day. Power outages during Wilma, back in 2005, went from 36% of customers to 16% by the 5th day after landfall, an average recovery rate of about 4% of customers per day. Dr. Dillingham, I'm curious, with this in mind, and can you speak generally about improvements that have been made to make our grid more resilient, and specifically maybe focus on discussion of the utilization of underground lines as a means of increasing resiliency? We see a lot of our barrier islands and beach communities in Florida moving to this. Not only because it's aesthetically appealing, but we get hit by hurricanes a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. Yeah, there have been significant improvements, particularly in the resilience of the transmission distribution infrastructure. We are seeing quicker response times. There's a lot better coordinated deployment, as Mr. Baum talked about within the ERCOT region. The systems are just becoming more robust to deal with this. When you talk about burying lines versus aerial lines, the significant issues with that is it may solve some problems in some areas where there is high wind events, but where there's a lot of flooding, that could actually put it at considerable risk if they're not properly designed. And so you need to, as I kind of mentioned earlier, developing
I think I'm assuming proper designing.
Proper designing, right.
Wouldn't we?
We would assume proper design there. But what we typically find is that if we start, like within Houston, we have lines that are above ground and below ground. The concern there is that in more flooding environments, you just have a higher risk of those lines being disrupted versus if they're above ground. And so it's just, you have to make that trade-off. If you're going to pay the additional dollars to bury them, are they properly developed and properly can mitigate against that flooding risk there? But to your point, there we have seen significant improvements in the way in which our systems have been designed. They're more flexible. There's allowing for better rerouting of power. And so, yes, they have improved considerably. But we need to keep in mind also that, the focus right now, of course, we've had 3 significant hurricane events, and so we are talking about that quite a bit right now. But there's a lot of other issues that are being dealt with across the country. If it's wildfire, if it's ice storms, if it's drought, that can also have significant impacts. That if we're preparing just for hurricanes and preparing for floods, we may be missing the point as far as preparing for some of these other disasters. And so we need to continue to figure out what's the best way to develop a diverse, resilient grid that can deal with as many problems as possible.
Maybe we should talk about those then. If we're talking about fire, isn't it probably better to have your transmission lines underground than above ground also?
I would assume so, yes, because you're taking away that risk.
And if you're talking about ice, wouldn't the same hold?
For ice, it could, but then you're looking at just a significant increase in the cost when you bury lines versus having them above ground. And so it becomes, how much are we willing to pay to have that additional resilience in there, and where's that funding going to come from, and how much are we going to pass on to ratepayers in that regard? And then that's just the trade-off there. In many cases, except for pretty much flooding, you can have a more resilient system underground. It's protected from those events, but are we willing to pay that additional cost to have that resilience in there?
Maybe we should look at it this way. If you're talking about additional cost and you don't underground them, but you keep replacing them above ground, you got that replacement cost every time, or the repair cost every time, versus maybe you come close to eliminating it.
Absolutely right, but the way in which economics are typically valued into these projects is first costs, and what is the first cost and that initial cost for me versus long-term life cycle analysis, which needs to be considered further.
Wouldn't it be more enlightened to consider the reality of, having to replace over and over and over again versus the likelihood of maybe not?
Absolutely. It's just that's not how decisions are made at this point. It's very much a kind of a short-term viewpoint versus a long-term viewpoint.
We're in this for the long haul.
Oh, absolutely. You're absolutely right.
Right.
I agree with you on that. Yeah.
I yield my time. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chris. The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to thank each of you for your testimony. It's been very interesting on a very important subject. Let me switch gears with you. Smart meters, Mr. Imhoff. What kind of information is gathered and how is it used?
The smart meters typically monitor consumption in the home. The utilities then use that to support their billing function. And then, in addition, the utilities use them in support of their outage management systems to help detect in real time when outages occur. Today, the majority of utilities still wait for a phone call from a customer to inform them that the power's out in a distribution feeder area. But in areas that are served by a combination of smart meters and then distribution automation devices in the substation have delivered substantial improvements. Avista in Washington State, an investor-owned utility there, as they moved to distribution and smart metering, they reduced the frequency of outages by 21% for the customers, and they reduced the duration of outages by 10%, and in a very cost-effective fashion. So typically, that's how that information is used to support the billing and the outage management systems. I'm not aware of any other key value streams.
Let me ask you this. What is your opinion? Are privacy and security concerns on the information that is gathered something that we ought to, that the customer ought to be concerned with, and is it encrypted in your, from what you know?
Yeah, go ahead.
So thank you very much for that question. I'll jump in. So with regard to to answer your question simply, there are many different brands of smart meters. There are many different schemes that are being used. But in general, yes, the information is encrypted, and steps are taken for privacy. With regard to cybersecurity issues and the meters, there's probably less concern about privacy, but a potential concern that again is being thought about carefully, so the sky is not falling, but potential concerns with regard to someone who may try to gain control of those smart meters from the outside. So smart meters do have the ability to control power flow to the house, and so one must design architectures, and those who are designing smart meters are well aware of this, that ensures that the control of those meters cannot be placed in the hands of an adversary.
And we would depend on experts like each of you to tell us which meters, as technology improves, can avoid some of this. Because as Congressman Banks said, when you mention cybersecurity hacks, particularly with the Chinese, with the military, their face gets very serious, and it's a huge problem. And Dr. Dillingham, again, back on the underground versus overhead, we're a developer. I've seen the number of lines that are cut inadvertently and the problems that it has, additional to the heavy cost that it takes to put them underground and the right-of-ways that come with that. So I appreciate your mentioning the cost, because it's a huge factor. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Norman. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Byers, recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much, and thank all of you for being with us today. You know, it's very important that we're having this hearing, especially because our president is visiting Puerto Rico today, and it's at a time when we talk about electrical grid utility resiliency. Puerto Rico has virtually no electrical grid to speak of. FEMA Director Long said yesterday, rebuilding Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria will be a Herculean effort. The Army Corps of Engineers doing temporary power right now, 74 generators in place, 400 to come, but I think as of this morning, only a little more than 5% of Puerto Ricans have had their power restored. According to the Army Corps of Engineers, for some areas of Puerto Rico, it might take upwards of 10 months before their power is restored. And it's not just the electrical grid system that's in crisis. As of 3 p.m. yesterday, fewer than half of all Puerto Ricans had access to clean drinking water, limited to no cell phone service. There have been 90,000 applications for FEMA assistance. We know of 16 known fatalities, and that doesn't count those who may have died in their homes yet to be discovered. It's 2 weeks after Maria, but now we do finally have an aid package for Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. So, Mr. Chairman, may I suggest perhaps a follow-up hearing on the resiliency of the electrical grid in Puerto Rico. And Dr. Dillingham, if today was a hearing about how we should respond to Puerto Rico, based on your expertise, what solutions would you suggest to make the grid more resilient? What are the near-term solutions to bring power back faster? Do those include renewables?
Thank you for that question. This is absolutely very important topic at this point. The significant problem within Puerto Rico was the loss of the transmission distribution infrastructure. The power plants fared just fine there, and they have a fairly diverse set of power plants there. They have some natural gas plants, solar, wind, variety of plants. It was the transmission distribution infrastructure that went down, and it's going to take a while to get back up. When you look at the power prices within Puerto Rico and look at what are the different microgrid options that are out there, it's starting to make some pretty good economic sense to start seeing more solar battery deployments out there. We've already seen potentially the wall packs being donated by Tesla to some degree. But a wider distribution of these types of microgrid systems that are not dependent on fuel resources necessarily, or not dependent on LNG terminals being on, or transmission distribution terminals working, or making sure that different types of fuel shipments make it there. And if you're in a hurricane-prone area, such as Puerto Rico, the ability to have smaller, resilient microgrid systems is probably the best effort. And the quickness in which you can deploy a microgrid system, especially a solar battery system, it happens far more quickly than you can deploy any other type of infrastructure out there at this point. And when you look at models of what's happening in Hawaii, who has similar power costs, and you start seeing their distribution or their development and deployment of microgrids out there. It's a good example to start looking at. The economics are there, the technology is there, and it's really just a matter of starting to introduce it at that point.
Great. Thank you very much. You know, this hurricane season isn't even over yet. It's generated more destructive storms than we've seen in a long time. 4 of this year's storms became Category 4 or 5 storms. 3 of those made landfall in the United States. The University of Wisconsin called Harvey a 1,000-year flood, once every 1,000 years. Quote, nothing in the historical record rivals this. Maria was the 10th most intense hurricane ever. Jose and Irma, only time in recorded history that 2 active hurricanes simultaneously had wind speeds in excess of 150 miles an hour. So while we talk about electrical grid, we cannot afford to avoid the larger scale issue that these storms are becoming more intense as the climate warms, as it changes. So, Mr. Baum, are utilities, especially those in Texas, taking climate change, the increasing severity of storms into account in their planning? What are you doing to upgrade the grid system to recognize that we're living in a world where the climate's changing?
I think there's no question that we are taking into consideration the new normal after events like this. And as I stated earlier, we had a substation in Houston that flooded that had not flooded in 50 years. That substation is now being rebuilt to prepare for what is now the flood of record. And I think all of the design that utilities do, it basically says, all right, what's the worst case scenario that we've seen, and now how do we build our system to prepare and be ready to face the next type of storm. So I definitely think practical planning is something that utilities are doing and will continue to do going forward.
Well, thank you for your vision and your answer. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Byer. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Webster, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for coming. I thought about, as Mr. Foster was talking about AC and DC, maybe Edison will get a car named after him and instead of the Tesla. And it's amazing all the things he's doing, including the battery packs that the company is sending are all DC, and yet he was the greatest promoter of AC. It's kind of interesting switch of events. Mr. Baum, in Texas, in the last hurricane, which just passed, was there a lot or minimal or in between those two damage to the high tension wires from the generator to, let's say, the substation? Or was most of the outages caused by the lower voltages?
A combination of both. But I would say most of the customer outages were caused were more on the distribution system that were caused by flooding and substations being out, which then knocks out the distribution system. But we did have we had 6 of our largest 345 kilovolt transmission lines were downed or damaged for a while during the storm. And a large number of smaller transmission lines were also affected. So it was both in this storm, both transmission and distribution, which again, though lights in the whole state never flickered, and a lot of that is because of the redundancy in both the transmission and the distribution network.
So from just a hardening standpoint, is there any change that needs to be done to the high tension lines in order to make them more resilient?
I think you're always looking at ways to develop. I mean,
Let me ask you, my knowledge is from a long time ago, so are they still aluminum with steel cable running with them, or is there a new type of transmission wiring?
Most of the transmission wiring is still as you described.
Okay.
I think if there are advancements being made, a lot of it is in the structures that hold up the transmission lines and finding ways to design those better to withstand storm.
So what was the cause of a structure? Was it external flying debris, or was it water, or what was it that would?
With our transmission lines that were affected, it was high winds that were twisting the structures that hold up the lines, and you didn't really have a lot of lines breaking. It was more high winds twisting the structures that holds them up that brought down power lines.
So is there would there be an effort now to come up with a better way to build those structures or to harden them in any way?
I think definitely. We have a new chair of our Public Utility Commission. Deanne Walker was just named after the storm, and at a meeting last week, she basically said, let's get the utilities and other providers together to see what ways we can improve for the next storm, and I'm sure that's one of the things that we'll be looking at.
I mean, I would think that rebuilding something like that would be a long-term. Was there a way, you were talking about rerouting, doing some other things, were those all able to be rerouted around those structures that fell or were twisted?
They were able, through a combination of rerouting and having some power plants that our grid operator contracts with to ramp up to provide voltage support to some of those areas that were affected by the lines that went down, and so there were ways to make it to where this did not the loss of the transmission system didn't cause a cascading effect.
Awesome. Okay, yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. That concludes our questions for the day. Thank you all for your wonderful testimony. It's very enlightening to us, and we have lots to do on our part as well. So appreciate everybody's being here, and we stand adjourned.